Voy a pasar ahora a presentarles al siguiente conferencista. Tenemos a Jack Bobo. Jack Bobo es el CEO de Futurity, una empresa que se dedica a predecir el futuro de los alimentos para ayudar principalmente a las marcas y a las grandes compañías a anticiparse las tendencias para que obviamente no desaparezcan. Aprovechan los conocimientos sobre tecnologías de alimentos, actitudes de los consumidores y tendencias de los mismos para ofrecer resultados significativos para los clientes. Jack regularmente es un orador habitual sobre tendencias mundiales en temas de agricultura, percepciones de los consumidores sobre el riesgo, la comunicación científica y el arte de las redes. Futurity básicamente está ubicada en la intersección entre los alimentos, la tecnología y el diseño, aprovechando la ciencia, las políticas, los valores y la comunicación en apoyo de las empresas que están mejorando la salud y la sostenibilidad del sistema alimentario mundial. Aprovechamos nuestros conocimientos sobre tecnología de alimentos, actitudes de los consumidores y tendencias de los consumidores para ofrecer resultados significativos para sus clientes. La charla de hoy de Jack se va a centrar mucho en justamente cómo los consumidores están cambiando sus hábitos de consumo, las nuevas tendencias a partir desde el mercado, desde cómo los consumidores empiezan a comprar nuevos productos. Y bueno, voy a permitir a Jack que nos hable sobre el tema. Jack, are you there?
I'm here.
Perfect. Good to have you here. So if you can start presenting, we are ready now.
Okay, so I think I will get the video here in a second, just
Okay.
waiting for to be the host so that I can turn on my video.
Okay, sure, perfect.
So it says that the host has stopped the video, so perhaps it needs to be transferred over to me.
Okay, let me see. Okay, you can do it now.
Let's see. It still says you cannot start your video because the host has stopped it.
Let me see. You're there.
Great. Sorry about the technical difficulty. I appreciate the opportunity to speak to this audience about a topic that's very interesting and important for me, which is the future of food technology and how it can be used to create a sustainable and a nutritious future. Before I begin my formal presentation, I'd like to provide a little bit more background on who I am and what my company Futurity does. So I've been working in food technology for about 20 years now. I spent 13 years at the US Department of State working on global food policy. I spent a few years covering Africa, food technology, and food trade. Then I worked in Asia for a few years. Then I was responsible for Europe. Then I ran our global biotechnology program. And my last few years, my only job was giving speeches. So I traveled to about 50 or 60 countries around the world talking about the future of food, the role of science, and how do we better communicate to the public. And that really brings us to the conversation today. However, after I left the State Department, I worked at a biotechnology company called Intrexon. You probably haven't heard of it, but it was the parent company for the Arctic apple, which is a genetically engineered apple that doesn't brown, for Oxitec, which created genetically engineered mosquitoes to fight Zika and other diseases like dengue, and also animal cloning, so all sorts of new and innovative technologies. We were also one of the largest livestock producers, livestock genetics companies in the United States. So I did that until about a year ago when I started Futurity. And here at Futurity, we try to help companies understand not just the trends that other people are talking about, not the trends that you're hearing about in the newspaper, because if you're reading the newspaper to find out what a trend is, it's already too late. What we want to do is to help you understand the forces that are shaping the trends so that you can get ahead of those trends as a company or an organization. And so a lot of this, though, has to do with communication, marketing, and understanding the landscape. So let me begin my presentation now, and I will share my screen. And so I suspect my presentation is going to be a little bit different than what you heard from Nate. And there may even be some things that are challenging the ideas that he brought up, and hopefully that will lead to a really good conversation. So I want to talk to you about how consumers are going to shape the future of food. It's not just about technology, it's not just about innovation, but it's about what are the consumers willing to adopt. And I'll get more into that as we go along. Now, the challenge that we have, Nate laid out some of that already. There's nothing we do that has a bigger, more negative impact on the planet than agriculture, but there's nothing more critical for our daily survival. So the challenge that we all have is to maintain and grow the benefits and reduce the negatives. Now, I think you're all familiar with many of the negatives associated with agriculture, and some of that can be found in the World Wildlife Fund's Living Planet report. But if we were to talk about land, 40% of all the land on Earth is currently being used for agriculture. The amount of cropland is the size of South America. The amount of pasture land is the size of Africa. So in terms of land, there is nothing bigger than agriculture, nothing more critical. If we were to talk about water, 70% of all fresh water that humans use goes to agriculture. So there's nothing more important than agriculture. And if we were to talk about climate change, 10 to 15% of all greenhouse gases come from agriculture. Another 10 to 15% comes from deforestation, 80% of which is caused by agriculture. So agriculture is almost as big as the energy sector. But what's interesting is that for every dollar you spend on wind and solar, you get less than $1 back because they're less efficient than fossil fuels. Now, those are critical long-term investments for our future. But for every dollar you invest in agriculture, you get $1.43 back everywhere in the world, positive rates of return. So you have to wonder, would consumers rather pay more for their energy or less for their food to have a cleaner environment? And I think, at least in the United States, consumers would rather eat their way to a cleaner environment. I can say that because I don't work for the government anymore. And so there's very little that's bigger than agriculture in terms of the climate conversation. And then finally, in terms of biodiversity, well, just since 1970 alone, 60% of all the wildlife populations on the planet have disappeared. And that's largely, again, because of agriculture. And so there's just nothing more important in terms of its negative impact, but it's also critical for our daily survival, as I mentioned. Now, that's the environmental conversation, but what about hunger? Well, today, there will be 800 million people who will go to bed hungry. And because of COVID, that's really closer to 850 million people will go to bed hungry. So it's not that there's just this challenge of the impact of producing the food to feed the people today. We're not even feeding nearly 1 billion people properly. So we actually need more food than we have today. And that's the present situation. If we look forward over the next 30 years, we're going to add about 2 billion more people to the planet. We're going to go from 7.8 billion people to 9.8 billion people. And again, those people will be needing more food. And what's important is that they're also increasing income. So those 2 billion people will not just need a little bit more food, they'll need a lot more because their income will allow them to buy more food. And the very first thing that people choose to supplement in their food as their income rises is protein. And that's normally animal protein. So the growth in demand for food will actually be greater than the increase in the number of people. And that's why, according to the Food and Agriculture Organization, we will need to produce between 50 and 60% more food by 2050 than we're producing today. And to put that challenge into perspective, one of the former Secretary Generals of FAO, Jacques Diouf, said that the amount of food that needs to be produced in the next 40 or 50 years is greater than the amount of food that was produced in the last 10,000 years of human civilization. So we need to produce as much food in 40 years as we produced in 10,000 years. That's an enormous challenge. So we have the impacts of agriculture today, and we have the demands of a growing planet that are going to make it even harder to sustainably and nutritiously feed the world. So that's just the challenge that we normally think about. Now, the solution to the problem is technology and innovation, and Nate talked some about that, and that's a lot of what these presentations are about. And if we look back over time, we should actually feel pretty good about where we are, because if you look at global production of cereal and grains and rice and maize and other products, they've grown enormously. And so they've actually outpaced the growth in population. And that's important because production has increased faster than population. The number of people who are hungry has declined over time. But more importantly, if you look at the bottom line, that's the amount of land needed to produce those crops. We use barely more land today than we did back in 1961, and yet we're producing 2 to 3 times as much food. That's an incredible improvement. And because we've done that, we haven't had to cause nearly as much deforestation as we would have without these productivity gains. Now, the result of that production increasing faster than population is that we've reduced global hunger. And if you went back 50 years, about 36%, about a third of all the people on the planet went to bed hungry. Today, that number is about 12%. So only about 12% of the people go to bed hungry today. And so many of the conversations around agriculture today talk about agriculture is the problem to be solved. But if we look at 1960 as our baseline, what we find is things are wildly better today than they were in the past. And so productivity has increased, hunger has decreased. So things are not bad and getting worse. Things are good and getting better, just not fast enough. And so we need to find a way of reframing this conversation so that consumers, so that the public understands the enormous contribution of agriculture to creating the sustainable future that we all want. Now, there are organizations like the World Resources Institute that have looked at what would be a menu of solutions that we could develop in order to create that sustainable future. And I'm not going to talk much about this graph. It's available on the World Resources Institute website, wri.org. But what's interesting here is a couple of things. First, that there are opportunities for investments in food waste, in diets, in technology, and all sorts of things. And so there are enormous opportunities for investment in food technology. It's in a very exciting time. And I'm going to touch on a few of those before I turn to the main topic, which is, of course, communication and consumer psychology. So one of the technologies is plant-based foods, and Nate just talked about that. I'm going to talk about it in a little bit different way in a few minutes, though. And of course, there's fermentation of proteins, as he talked about Perfect Day. And then, of course, there are the cell-based meats or lab-grown meat for companies like Memphis Meats. Now, I didn't mention at the beginning, but as a consultant, somebody who's been working in this industry for a long time, I've worked with more than 50 or 60 startups in the food technology space. And I've been an advisor to cell-based companies, plant-based meat companies, fermentation companies, but I'm also on the Dairy Advisory Council for the US dairy industry. I've advised the livestock industry. And so I don't have a particular perspective in terms of who should be a winner or a loser in this conversation. My goal is for all of them to become more sustainable and nutritious in the food that they produce. So there's not one solution, there are many solutions. Now, if we get away from some of the consumer-facing technologies that Nate was talking about, there are all sorts of robotic solutions that are out there to increase or enhance the efficiency and productivity of plants. Rohini is just one. Modern Meadow is another company that's producing leather and other products using some of the same technologies that Nate was talking about. But there are also crops like cover crops, which are becoming more adopted in the United States and certainly in other places. There's gene editing, which is technology that we could talk about, and then other digital technologies that are allowing us to have a better understanding of the supply chain, blockchain, and other technologies. Again, a lot of technologies out there, but will they come to market? Will they have an impact? And so that's what I call the other challenge. So the first challenge is just that, we have all of these problems, but there's another challenge that relates to how consumers think about these problems. And so it's important to recognize that science tells us what we can do, but it's the public that tells us what we should do. And that's an important distinction. You can have an amazing technology, but if consumers don't want it, it won't matter. And this comes up a lot in conversations about what is sustainable and what does sustainability mean to you? Now, for some people, organic production is the most sustainable agriculture there could be. Or today, regenerative agriculture is becoming more common. But for others, GMOs, gene editing, those are technologies which are actually more sustainable. So is it a question of somebody being right and somebody being wrong, or is it more complicated than that? So when we think about sustainability in terms of the public generally thinks of sustainability in terms of local sustainability. And local sustainability means reducing pesticides, reducing fertilizer, reducing soil erosion, reducing waste and loss. So consumers are thinking of sustainability in terms of having a smaller impact on farms. But there's a different way of thinking about sustainability, which is global sustainability. Because if you can produce more food very intensively on less land, then there's less pressure on global forests. And so the more we produce in the United States or Europe or on the farms that exist in Brazil, the less need there is to push into protected areas. And so that's very different. That suggests that intensive agriculture is more sustainable globally, as opposed to local sustainability, which is focused on reducing the impact at the farm level. And what's important here is that there isn't a right or wrong answer. Local sustainability is important, and global sustainability is important, but consumers only think in terms of local sustainability. And so if you're developing new technologies, it's important to understand you may feel like you have a very sustainable technology, but the consumer may not see it in the same way. And so just a couple weeks ago, the European Commission released a report called its Farm to Fork Strategy. And three of the things that were mentioned in that report were their goals of reducing pesticide risk by 50% over the next decade, reducing fertilizer use by 20%, and expanding organic agriculture to 25% of all the agricultural land in Europe. So each of these choices are about reducing local impacts or enhancing local sustainability. But what would be the impact of focusing on local sustainability in Europe? Well, what happens is that if Europe produces less food itself, then somebody else will have to produce it for them. And it's important to remember that even today, before they've implemented any of these policies, Europe imports 70% of its animal feed needs. And the country that sends the most food to Europe is Brazil. So Europe is exporting its environmental footprint for agriculture to South America right now. But they're not just exporting the footprint, they're also trying to limit the adoption of technology in South America. And so they're sending their problem to South America, and then they're limiting the ability of those who live and work in South America to produce those products sustainably. And so that becomes a challenge for all of us. And the policies that Europe is promoting are going to make it even more difficult. And Europe has said in their statement that they want to export these ideas to other parts of the world. So they want other countries to focus on local sustainability. But that's just going to create more pressure on sensitive parts of the world. So we need to find a way of balancing local sustainability and global sustainability. And that will only occur if the public understands the importance of global sustainability. So I don't like to talk about it in terms of good or bad, right or wrong. It's really just about choices and consequences. Europe has the right to choose how they want to produce food in Europe, but there will be consequences to those choices. And some of those consequences will be negative for the global environment. And so we need to be able to understand these choices and consequences for different types of food adoption. And we need to be able to communicate that to the public so that the public will come to appreciate intensive agriculture and its contribution in the same way that they already understand the importance of local sustainability. So rather than think of sustainability as a destination, this is sustainable agriculture, we need to think of it as in terms of a journey. Sustainability is a journey, not a destination. And we need to have consumers understand that sustainability is a journey. And if they do, they will begin to realize that farmers have been on the sustainability journey for over 100 years. Every year, agriculture gets better than it was the year before. And if we look back 50 years, agriculture is wildly better than it was before. So what's actually exciting is that consumers for the first time are joining farmers and technology companies in being part of that journey. And that's why it's important to use 1970 or 1960 as the baseline and not focus solely on today as the baseline. But there's another challenge. And this other challenge actually relates very much to some of the technologies and ideas that Nate was talking about. And that's how we talk about food. Now, one of the things that we have to worry about is this idea of something called chemophobia. The public is more and more concerned in the United States and Europe, and these ideas are spreading to other places about chemicals in their food. So that's a strange idea because our food supply, the global food supply, has never been safer and consumers have never been more scared. So the safer our food gets, the more worried people get. And when they're worried about it, they start asking for companies to remove preservatives and food additives and other things from the food, which might make it less safe, and it might reduce shelf life, which increases food waste. So consumers are asking for one thing, but it may undermine other goals that they have. Other things to think about, though, are when we talk about food, and I talk to a lot of big food company clients, whether that's a Tyson or a Coca-Cola or other companies, those are the big food companies. And many people talk about how they're not able to innovate anymore. And there are reasons why big companies might not be very good at innovation. They're big, they're slow, they're risk averse, and they're often indecisive. So it does make sense that these companies might be bad at innovation, but I don't think that's really what's happening. I think consumers don't want innovation to come from big food companies because innovation is change and change is scary. And so if consumers are going to try something new, they want to know they can trust the company selling it to them. So I want to give you a couple of examples. The first is a company called Yoplait that just 10 years ago was the dominant yogurt producer in the United States. But then along came Greek yogurt and the company Chobani, and it completely dominated the market, and Yoplait's sales crashed. And when people saw that, 5 years later, they thought, how could Yoplait have missed the Greek yogurt trend? They were so well positioned to be successful in that. Why did a small company succeed when a big company couldn't? And many of the reasons they would say is that they just weren't able to move quickly enough. They were slow. They were afraid of taking chances. That's the normal story that we hear. But let me give you a second example. So today, you may be hearing about products called Oatly, which are oat milk, and Nate mentioned this as one of the plant-based food trends. So oat milk is a really hot topic. Well, Quaker Oats, which is an American company that makes oat products for over 100 years, they actually created an oat milk product a year before Oatly came to market. So they were first, they were innovative. They saw the idea and they moved. And in January of this year, they killed the product because sales were so bad. So how can that be when a big food company does get ahead of the trend that it still fails? Well, it failed because people who try new foods are early adopters. And people who are early adopters don't want to buy food from Quaker Oats because that's a big food company. So when they hear that Quaker Oats has oat milk, they think that's a boring product. But then all of a sudden, a new company comes along like Oatly with really the same product. And those same early adopters think, oh, wow, that sounds really exciting. And so they give it a try. And so sometimes it's important for big food companies not to be the first to market, but actually to be the second to market. And that way, all of the consumers who are interested in it, but are afraid to try this new product from a small company would feel safe trying oat milk from Quaker Oats. So what they really should have done is they should have brought the product to market in January, the same month that they killed the product. And so understanding these consumer trends and understanding consumer psychology can help food companies to get ahead of the trend and make better decisions. And it's never been more important than it is today to understand why consumers are making the decisions that they are. So I'll give you another example. Now, Nate talked about the heme that's used to make the Impossible Burger bleed, and it's the secret sauce, the special ingredient in the Impossible Burger. But I don't think he mentioned that it's a genetically modified ingredient. And so, that's really interesting because imagine for a moment that Monsanto had created the Impossible Burger. They had the technology, they definitely could have done it. But we all know it would have failed. And it would have failed because consumers wouldn't have wanted to buy a GMO burger from Monsanto. The newspapers would have said it failed because nobody wants to buy a GMO burger. But that's not true because they were happy to buy the Impossible Burger from a small food tech startup. So understanding a product that's not acceptable from a big food company can be completely acceptable coming from a small company. And so understanding how consumers think about technology, it's not just the technology, but it's the company that's providing that technology that's very important. And so I'll give you a couple more examples. So one of the things that happened with Impossible Foods is that people were very excited about the product. It was doing extremely well. And then they went into 18,000 Burger Kings. The day they went into 18,000 Burger Kings, people started complaining that the food product was ultra processed. And being ultra processed or highly processed food has become a very negative term in the United States and Europe and other places. And people started complaining that the product was unhealthy. But rich people didn't care that the product was ultra processed when it was sold in expensive restaurants for $20 a burger. They only cared that it was ultra processed when poor people could afford it in Burger King. And so the relationship to the consumer changed as the product and technology scaled. And companies need to be prepared for that change in their relationship to the consumer. Now, Impossible Foods has continued to be successful, but they've had a lot of pushback on this issue of ultra processed. And I think that's an important issue as well for all of the technologies that Nate talked about. They all fall into this category of ultra processed. And ultra processed food is not consistent with the health and wellness trend. And so we need to recognize that consumers are inconsistent all the time. They say they want one thing, but then they buy another thing. So consumers buy ultra processed foods every day, but they also say they hate ultra processed foods. So understanding how to position your product is more important than whether it's processed or not processed. And again, I want to give you some examples of how consumers think and how we position products. So one of the consumer psychology issues that we're dealing with is something called the naturalness bias. Consumers generally have a preference for natural products and a little bit more of a fear, that chemophobia, for products that are man-made. And that bias is reflected in their purchasing decisions. So here we have an example that when a company puts natural on a food label, even though it doesn't actually mean anything in US labeling, consumers are nearly 40% more likely to want to purchase that product, even though it doesn't actually mean anything. And so it's actually more influential than having the non-GMO label. It's more influential than having an organic label, and it's totally meaningless. So natural is something that we all think happy thoughts when we hear the word natural. We think butterflies, rainbows, and puppies, even though salmonella and Zika and dengue and Ebola, all of these bad things are natural too, but we all think happy thoughts. So understanding consumer psychology is critically important. Another thing that's going on is something called the health halo effect, or the halo effect. That consumers, when they hear something is plant-based, they automatically think that it must be healthier for them. And so that's why most consumers that are buying Impossible Burgers or Beyond Burgers say that the number one reason they're doing it is for health reasons, even though they're no healthier. And so people will make mistakes because of something called the halo effect. And again, understanding that psychology. So the halo effect around plant-based foods overcomes the negative association of processed foods in this example. So another area is, how do you frame the conversation? And so that's what's happening with the products that Nate's talking about, is that currently they're being framed as plant-based. They're not being framed as ultra-processed. But in many places in Europe, there's a big push to reduce ultra-processed foods. And all of these products are going to get captured by that policy change unless there's a conversation that allows them to be separated from processed foods like junk food, and talk about processed foods that may have some health benefits. So that's part of the larger landscape that investors and technology developers and food companies need to be aware of. as they're developing these new technologies. So I'll give you another example of how you frame the conversation. Another psychology principle is something called cognitive dissonance. It's really just what happens when you have two different ideas in your head at the same time, and how do we deal with that? So that's one of the reasons why it's so hard for consumers to eat insects, because most of us think negative thoughts when we hear somebody saying, would you like to try these crickets? You know, we're like, yuck, that sounds terrible. And so if you look at this energy bar on the screen right now, it's called Cricket Energy Bar. Well, the problem with putting the cricket right there on the label in having a big picture of an insect is that on one hand, people like protein. On the other hand, they hate crickets. And so you're sort of forcing them to choose one thing or the other. And a lot of consumers may just say, no, I don't want to give it a try, because they feel a little disgusted by the idea of eating insects. So let's look at how another company has marketed their insect protein. So this one is called Jungle Bar. And if you look closely, there's a little bitty yellow label there that says insect protein. It's on the label, front of package. They're not trying to hide it, but it's not what's trying to sell the product. So the product on the right, there is no cognitive dissonance. You can just try this energy bar. So two products, exactly the same thing. One is trying to overcome dissonance, the other doesn't. So how you position your product or technology will have a huge impact on how it's adopted or how it's perceived by the consumer. And so there's a long list of these types of consumer psychology principles. I'm not going to go into them all now, but these are the sorts of things I do when I work with food tech startups, is to help them understand, how will the consumer think about your product? How does the name of your company impact perception? How does the marketing of your product, how do the words that you use impact consumer perception? And how do you frame it in the best possible way so that consumers are excited about your technology and don't reject it before they get a chance to understand its benefits? So one of the thoughts I want to leave you with, though, is that the next 30 years are the most important 30 years there have ever been in the history of agriculture. And they are, but they're also the most important 30 years there will ever be in the history of agriculture. And that's why we need to get it right. We have this small window of opportunity. If we can get to 2050 without cutting down our forests, without draining our rivers, our lakes, and our aquifers, in many ways, we're good forever, because population levels off so quickly after 2050. So it's really only these next 30 years that are so critical for our survival. And that's why the conversation we're having today is so important, and the work that you are all doing is so critical. But all of that technology will mean nothing if consumers don't allow you to use it. And so how you talk about it will determine if agriculture saves the planet or destroys it. So that's the end of my prepared remarks. I'll leave my email address up here on the screen for a few more minutes before I turn it off in case you want to reach out to me later. But with that, Luis, I would welcome any questions there might be.
Jack, thank you so much for your presentation. I think it was changing the mind of many people that is connected, including me. I think is very important and very interesting what you have presented today. I will start by making some questions. I have one from Lisbeth Vega, and she said, one of the biggest challenges to have a global food sustainable system is food waste. This is generated along the whole supply chain, including the final consumer. What are the recommendations to reduce that from a technology, cost, and food safety perspective? Well, it's a long question, actually. And how can we make the final consumer more aware of their environmental impact?
Yeah, so food waste is a really important and critical issue. About a third of all food is wasted in developed and developing countries. In developing countries, the food waste generally is wasted before it reaches the consumer. And in developed countries, it's usually post-consumer, where 40% of that waste occurs. And so it happens at different places in the supply chain, depending on the country you're in and the level of development. The other thing that's challenging about food waste, though, is that food waste depends on the product. So food waste for bread is different than food waste for potatoes and food waste for apples. And in the United States, those are the three most wasted food products. Number one is bread, number two is potatoes, number three is apples. And so it's not one problem, it's 1,000 problems. And so that's part of what makes it challenging, but those are also opportunities. So companies like Appeal that are creating edible food coatings are going to be able to extend the shelf life and reduce food waste. And that's a huge market opportunity. And it'll save money for consumers and it will give them a better product. That's a win-win. So things like that, we don't have to convince consumers to work on. In the United States, we're also looking at policy changes. So on many food products, consumers don't really know when foods go bad. So they actually throw out a lot of food that would have been perfectly safe to eat because it's gone past its best buy date. And people often think the best buy date is a safe buy date, when it really just means after this date, the quality of the product begins to decline. And so there are steps being taken to educate consumers on what those product labels really mean. For some products like meat, it really could mean it's unsafe, but something like Doritos or Cheetos, you can eat them a year later, they're going to taste terrible, but they're not going to kill you. So it's a little different depending on the products.
Excellent. We have another question from Carlos. He's asking us, based on your experience, what is your opinion about systems that combine aquaculture and hydroponic production? It can be a real sustainable and efficient practice?
Yes, I think that we're going to continue to develop more of these combined systems. Civiculture is another area that's very similar. It's having livestock production among trees and other crops. And so I think that we're going to come up with more and more of these natural systems, and they will have co-benefits. It's the same thing with insect protein, where today insect protein tends to be more expensive than traditional protein. And so insect protein companies tend to be built next to a food waste stream. So next to a bakery or some other company, so that what was a waste product becomes a valuable commodity because it becomes food for the insects. And so being able to combine waste with benefits, is a terrific idea.
Perfect. I also noticed one of the comments that you made, it was interesting. I mean, the way you compare large companies versus startups and the way they communicate. I mean, it doesn't mean that the size is becoming important, but the way they reach the customers and the way, they are not only communicating the technology, but how some attributes become more important to consumers, right?
Yeah. Well, and so we see this right now because you have JBS, Tyson, Smithfield, Cargill, all of these companies are producing plant-based alternatives. But do you think consumers are going to look at a Tyson burger and an Impossible burger and think that Tyson Foods is doing this because they're trying to save the planet and protect my health? The consumers are probably going to think Tyson sees a market opportunity. Right. So it's hard for them to compete on terms of sustainability and nutrition because consumers aren't going to believe it. But if I was Tyson, instead of trying to compete directly with the Impossible Burger, I would be marketing my product as Tyson, a company with 100 years of experience of bringing safe and nutritious protein to your family. It's based on nostalgia, experience, comfort. So people who might be unwilling to try an Impossible Burger because that sounds really strange, like my parents, might see, oh, Tyson has, plant-based chicken. Well, I'll give that a try because it doesn't seem, surprising or innovative. So they actually should sell products because they're not innovative, as opposed to companies that are selling it because they are.
Definitely. Do you think, for example, let's look at what happens in the US or Europe or Asia, where small companies are having a lot of investment, and obviously they can compete with large companies in that case. But places like Africa or Latin America itself, for example, they cannot compete the same way. I mean, startups, the same way they compete in the US, for example. Do you think it can be possible, or do you see an opportunity for large companies to make joint ventures or strategies together with startups in order to go to the market where they can combine efforts and opportunities together?
Yeah, I think that there's a lot of opportunity for that kind of partnership. And, big companies in the United States and Europe should be looking for those opportunities, because what they can do is they can allow startups in the United States to identify a market, begin to build awareness, and then they don't have to place 100 bets. They can just see which one seems to be working. And then they can go to that country in Colombia or Brazil or Argentina and find a partner that, can help to do that. So they can bring the innovation and technology, but they still need a local partner who understands the local culture and is the face of the new brand.
Sure, definitely. The other thing that was interesting to me, to me it was clear something. It is not the size what determines to remain in the market. It is a combination of things, probably. It's like being innovative, being communicate well, and communicate also the proper attributes the consumer is looking for, right?
Yes.
So how large companies do you think, especially in Latin America, where probably some of them have more 50 years or maybe more, but we are looking now several startups that are entering the market and they are competing against, like if they were large companies as well. What do you think? What is your recommendation for those large companies to remain in the market?
Right. So, you have companies like Alpina that have a very strong position in Colombia. You have Grupo Bimbo in Mexico and obviously globally. And they don't have to be first. They can sit back and wait, and you can either acquire those companies or you can look at once the market is developed and then enter the market. And that was my example with Quaker Oats, that they could have dominated the entire oat milk market. They could have owned 90% of the market if they had just started 2 years later. And so sometimes those companies, consumers don't think of Coca-Cola as an innovative company. They innovate all the time, but that's not what people think. It's comfort, it's nostalgia. So companies need to understand, what does their brand mean to the consumer? And then they need to make sure that they position their new product in a way that's consistent with their brand.
Sure.
And that's what companies sometimes want, to be cool and hip and innovative, and that's not what the consumer wants from them.
Sure, definitely. No sé si tengamos más preguntas de la audiencia, si quisieran hacernos alguna otra pregunta o algún comentario. Well, it looks like everybody's okay with your presentation. I think it was wonderful, definitely. And obviously it was interesting also having 2 points of views that sometimes were just different, or the perception was kind of different. I think we appreciate all your comments and the point of view you have presented to us, definitely.
Well, and it's not intended to be a criticism of the plant-based and the cell-based alternatives. It's what do they need to do in order to be successful? Because today a lot of the companies talk about how they are going to succeed by being cheaper than beef. And I think that's not true, because the day that plant-based burgers become cheaper than hamburger is the day that consumers think of hamburger as the quality premium product. So in the mind of the consumer, becoming cheaper than hamburger just makes you cheap and low quality. And that's for poor people. And then all of a sudden, rich people are going to be more interested in animal products. And so they shouldn't use the language of cheap. They should talk about it's going to become more affordable, but still quality. So, there are things that they need to change their communication, because they could end up undermining their own brands by how they talk about it.
Sure.
And with 20 plant-based meat burgers, there's not that much room in the grocery store for 20 or 30 plant-based burgers. There's room for a super premium product, a cheap product, a mid-price product, but not 20 or 30. Even one company could meet all of those different market segments. So they need to be thinking further down the road, not just what is going to happen next year, but where our products are going to be positioned 5 years from now.
Yeah, definitely. Well, Jack, thank you so much for your time, and thank you for sharing your knowledge and experience on all of these topics. Definitely, I think it was mind-blowing for many people. Yeah, we will talk soon, hopefully.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.